that Dr. Zuhdi Jasser is our guest for this hour. And Dr. Jasser, thank you so much for making time for us today.
Oh, it's great to hear you, Manny. Thanks for having me.
Well, you are coming out to Colorado to go to the Steamboat Institute, their foreign policy summit. You're one of just a dynamite panel of speakers. But I think you bring a perspective that I don't know if any of the other speakers bring, and that is you are an American Muslim, and you have a dog in the fight in a way that we don't necessarily have a dog in the fight, especially when it comes to Syria. If you could, give my listeners a little bit of a background of you and how you came to start your organization and what you guys are all about.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you so much for the opportunity. We formed our organization, the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, after 9/11 because we realized that the voices of Islam in America are really, most of whom were part of the problem. They weren't looking at solutions, but rather simply putting Band-Aids on the core issue. And my family had escaped Syria in the mid-'60s. I was born in the U.S. My father was a political refugee from the Ba'ath regime. Did not want to serve in that corrupt military. His father was in and out of house arrest after the French pulled out. There were attempts at democracy in Syria, and after 20 different military coups that happened in 1963, the Ba'athists, which are basically the Nazis of the Arab world, took over Syria, and Assad rose to power soon thereafter, the father, Hafiz Assad. And there was a significant brain drain. There's actually more expatriates out of Syria today than there are living in Syria, which is a population of 20 million. And, ultimately I think that the message is that in the 20th century, as Secretary Rice said in 2005 in Cairo, she said, for too long we have exchanged a policy of freedom and democracy in the Middle East for security and stability, and we've gotten neither. And her point is that we were, for too long, basically thinking that we could pick the lesser of two evils, and we always felt that the dictator we knew, that were our allies, no different than we think today the Saudis are our allies, and yet they are the boot camp for ISIS, is a paradigm that needs to change. And I wish my grandfather were alive to see what happened in Syria in 2011, where the people finally woke up. They were basically, as he told me when I was growing up in Wisconsin, he said, they had died, that the Syrian people were dead, and that's why he exchanged his Syrian nationalism for American nationalism and said, I can be more Muslim in America than I can anywhere else in the world, in these so-called Muslim countries that are being run by a mafia. And, today's evil empire is the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. So we in many ways have had policies, what I call a whack-a-mole program, where we, not only treat terror cells as a whack-a-mole, we wait for them to get weapons and decide they're going to attack us, but our approach to countries is whack-a-mole, where we basically wait for those countries to become unstable, and we haven't had really any president with a vision to look into the Middle East and say, well, what is the long-term vision here? Can liberty advance? What was the opportunity of the Arab awakening? And what are some long-term strategies versus the short-term? If ISIS is a good example, short-term, we get rid of ISIS. But long-term, if you don't have a strategy, you can't get rid of ISIS without getting rid of Assad. And families like mine will tell you that the use of chemical weapons that we've seen happen, the use of chemical weapons that we've seen happen in the past few years now is not a surprise to Syrians who saw Hama wiped out, 40,000 killed in 1982, another Hama massacre in 1963. I mean, there were tens of thousands being massacred and tortured in Syria for years, and the Arab awakening just sort of brought everybody to realize what was happening for a long time.
I think that many people cheered the Arab awakening. I mean, people cheered the Arab awakening around the world, especially in Egypt, and then we have the election of the Muslim Brotherhood. And I think that's concerning to people. And to be perfectly honest, Dr. Jasser, I mean, I look back at the Iraq War and the Afghanistan War and our interventions there and what has happened since then. And is it possible to gift another nation freedom, or is that something that has to happen from the nation itself? Do you understand what I'm asking?
Oh, absolutely. Well, here's the issue is you were not going to be able to win this battle militarily. However, we have to also have a strategy in which we help move those groups that would have our values in the right direction. As much as you may think, and we may think and agree, that Iraq is a total mess today, what would Iraq, I want you to look at it this way. Syria is a much bigger mess than Iraq, and we never went into Syria. Syria is a mess not because of the Arab awakening, but because of a regime that was smothering and torturing people for 2 generations. So Iraq would be Syria today if we had not gone in and removed that dictator. Now, I'm not saying that President Bush had a vision into the Arab awakening and knew that's what's going to happen, but to ask the question what was right to do in 2004, there was no Arab awakening. Today, as messy as Iraq is, the Iraqi people are blessed by having not had a dictator to get rid of, but now they're left with all this sectarian battle, and it's deteriorated because we pulled out, and we should have left some chaperones there for a community, a society that was still reeling from a dictatorship that only allowed the corrupt to survive and the honest to disappear. So Islam today, the Muslim world, is going through the same process that the West went through in its 14th, 15th, 16th, and 17th century when it finally began to push back against theocracy and started to have revolutions. And history has shown that revolutions don't always work the first time around. And I can tell you that if the Iranians, for example, right now Iran's the biggest threat on the planet, and yet the Iranians, if they had a free election, which was what they tried to do in the Green Revolution, they would never elect theocrats again. The Muslim Brotherhood, yes, they were elected, but then you had 10 million people come to the street to prove to you, number one, that it's not in our DNA as Muslims to want theocracy. They said, you know what, this is worse than Mubarak. We're going to reject this, and they rejected Morsi within 1 year. So I think they proved that, you can kill more bad ideas with sunlight than you can by pushing it underground. And I think that's what democracy experiments show, is that you kill bad ideas with good ideas rather than with military force, which has proven to only be every one of these countries is a cauldron of radical Islam because the dictators, look at Assad's methods in Syria. He's not bombing ISIS. He's bombing the moderate rebels because they're a much bigger threat to him existentially than ISIS ever could be. And that's why Russia is not bombing ISIS either. So this is the issue, is that we represent the free world. We represent, as Lincoln said, the last hope, the last best hope of mankind. We don't have to do it with our blood and always with our fortune, but if we don't, Russia, these are not civil wars. Russia, China, Iran especially, Assad is alive today, not because he survived a civil war. It's because he's being propped up by the most evil nations in the world.
316 on KOA News Radio. I'm talking with Dr. Zuhdi Jasser. And, Dr. Jasser, I said you had more of a dog in the fight in Syria than many of us. And I think that Syria has really become a political football that will be a big part of the presidential campaign, as our current president has, after drawing red lines all over, after drawing red lines all over the place, has shown no will to actually back them up. So what would you like to see in way of foreign policy as it pertains to Syria?
Yeah, I would tell you first, the big picture is, all roads lead to Damascus. So right now we see Saudi Arabia and Iran having a conflagration where Bahrain has now, which was supposedly a moderate nation, has said yesterday that there was a terror act that appeared to have been paid $30,000 by Iran to commit an act of terror. You see Iran on the verge of getting $100 billion, some of which will end up in Assad's coffers in Syria. Saudi Arabia executing 47 people that they threw in a few Shiite clerics in there, one cleric and 3 other Shiites, in order to make it appear that they're trying to antagonize Iran, when in fact they needed to get rid of 43 Sunnis that they had in jail because of the instability domestically there, which again is part of the Arab awakening issue and also part of the threat of ISIS that they created. But all these lead back to Syria, because in Syria you have a front line right now of a Sunni-Shia clash happening. Assad and Iran and Hezbollah being on the Shia side with Russia, and on the Sunni side you have the Free Syria Army with its most militant sides being the ISIS part, and the more moderate secular parts in the southwest, which many of our families are struggling with, and it's not all one entity. So the policy should be a regional policy where we say that we're going to promote a liberty doctrine, where we work with those who protect our values, believe in Western values. We started a movement called the Muslim Reform Movement, where in 2 pages we laid out that we as American Muslims, and that's also, we had a summit that included Canadian Muslims, European Muslims, and we all signed the declaration and said, we reject all Islamic states, not just ISIS, but all of them. We reject the caliphate. We reject violent jihad. We believe in the equality of men and women. We believe we stand against blasphemy laws, against apostasy laws, against the institutionalization of Sharia. So these things, there are Muslims that believe in a secular type government, that believe in freedom, that are trying to get their voices heard in this type of revolutions that are happening. And I think if we had a policy that we began to work with, I mean, in Iran, for example, the president presented the solution of either the nuclear deal or war, when in fact there was a third pathway, which was freedom, which was the Green Revolution with continued containment of the sanctions. If you don't think sanctions work, why have all the acts of terror against the West been Sunni acts of terror and not Shiite? Why? Because our allies, the Saudis, have been funding Islamic institutions in the West, fueling radicalization and groups like ISIS, versus Shia. We've been shutting them down. Institutions of Shiite radicalism of Hezbollah shut down. So there have been no acts of Shia terror, and that's now going to be unleashed. So our policy to Syria should be, number one, work with liberal institutions and groups. Number two, in the long term, number two, begin to help bring about the end of these dictators, because there is no pathway to solution, because the dictators right now are completely in bed with the radicals. They just are doing a magician's act and trying to prove to us that they're not.
Well, let me play devil's advocate for a second, because, we really have Russia fighting a proxy war right now. I mean, that's what's going on. We have Saudi Arabia fighting a proxy war. We have Iran fighting a proxy war. Why does the United States want to be a part of a proxy war, which seems to have 2 parts to it? Okay, Russia is trying to gain and secure their influence in the Middle East for a variety of reasons, pipelines, oil, whatever you want to throw out there. But at the same time, we're still having that internal struggle, Shia versus Sunni. When is that going to get settled? It would seem that if we can work out the Sunni-Shia situation, a lot of other things may be more manageable.
Actually, I would tell you that I agree with you, but it's backwards, in that the Sunni Shia thing is like Pepsi Coca-Cola. It's 2 flavors of the same problem, political Islam. I wrote a piece in the National Review last week called The Path Towards Victory Against Islamism, or Political Islam. So whether you're talking the Shia flavor of political Islam, which is Khomeinism and Hezbollah, and by the way, Assad, who claims to be secular, is completely in bed, tied at the hip with the Khomeinists, so he's not exactly secular. Or the Sunni version, which is the Muslim Brotherhood or the Wahhabis of Saudi Arabia, their both issue is theocracy. So America needs to get an ideological dog in the fight, which is just like we had Radio Free Europe against the Soviets, and we began to say, you know what, we're going to stand against socialism, against communism, not only against the Soviet idea, but we realized that the conveyor belt towards Soviet theory included communist and socialist theory. So similarly, these Islamist groups are not all unrelated. They read from the same text. They read from the same theocratic mindset. So we need to basically develop a policy where we walk the Muslim world into that process of the defeat of theocrats, no different than our founding fathers did. And I think Americans can begin to get their head around that battle, realize, yes, it's a long-term battle, but in the short term, there are a lot of Muslims on our side. The theocrats might have all the money in the military right now, but I tell you, the people of these countries do not want to be run by them. And if we're going to have credibility in this fight, staying away from it will basically, I've called the current policy, be it the Obama doctrine or really Rand Paul type doctrine, is basically the same thing, which is do nothing, is a Darwin doctrine where you sort of let the most evil evolve and just America stays out of it while Russia and others fuel those who decimate their populations with chemical weapons and otherwise.
I have, when we get back, I've got to take a break and do some news here in a moment. But when we get back, I want to get into some questions that I have had caller after caller after caller. And this has to do with our being at home. This is in the United States. And there's so much I don't want to say confusion, because a lot of my callers after 9/11, we all went and picked up a copy of the Quran and tried to make sense of the Quran and sort of learn more. I didn't know anything about Islam before 9/11. And I hate that was the catalyst, but a lot of people have looked at some of the aspects of Islam and said, look, there's in the Quran, you're allowed to lie to an infidel. You're allowed to not tell the truth. And it's created a level of distrust that makes it difficult, I'm sure, for you to get your message out, because it seems like the only people we hear from in the news media are people like CARE, that I happen to believe have a pretty significant agenda. But I'd like to get some clarification on some of that stuff, if you're comfortable going down that road with me.
Absolutely.
Okay, we're going to, where I'm talking to Dr. Zuhdi Jasser. By the way, I have links to his website, his book, and also to the Steamboat Institute, where you can buy tickets for the Foreign Policy Summit that he is going to be appearing. Great lineup of speakers. I mean, really good lineup of speakers, and it's happening January 22nd. All that's on the blog at KOANewsRadio.com. We'll be back with Dr. Jasser in just a moment, but Chad Hoffman is over there with some headlines. News Radio time is 3:35. I am talking with Dr. Zuhdi Jasser. He is going to be part of a Steamboat Institute Foreign Policy Summit coming up on January 22nd in Steamboat, oddly enough. I have got a link to all that if you want to buy tickets. There's a great lineup of speakers, and Dr. Jasser will be there. I also put links to his book and his organization, the American Islamic Forum for Democracy. But, Dr. Jasser, the first thing I ever read by you was your book, A Battle for the Soul of Islam, an American Muslim's Patriot's Fight to Save His Faith. And it was very illuminating for me, because it gave voice to what I would imagine are probably a lot of American Muslims who are just living their lives and just want to, go and practice their faith and not bother anybody and just kind of go about their business. What was the response from the Muslim community to your book?
Well, I think those that are paying attention to what we're doing, which includes, so many American Muslims that do feel a sense of urgency, that we are blessed as American Muslims to have a laboratory to be able to do the work that you just can't do anywhere else in the world. They said, they feel that this is a story that is theirs too, and that's why, I talked about being raised in Wisconsin and my family's desire to come to America and how that instilled in me a desire to want to serve in the U.S. Navy and be on a medical scholarship and want to give back through our formation of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, that we saw this not as a war against terrorism, which is a symptom, but that our mission is to separate mosque and state, to try to bring Jeffersonian principles to Islam that is not there yet, that Islam is a faith that we love, but yet the leadership of our community, the clerics, are still in that time in history where they have not separated mosque and state. And I'll tell you, I'm so glad you asked about American Muslims, because that's where our biggest problem is so many Muslims will tell me behind the scenes, thank you for what you're doing, but yet they don't have the urgency and the sense that this is something they own. They feel that, well, terrorism is just this thing abroad and it's not anything they think about, but yet they don't realize that, in many ways we need an intervention. We're like the alcoholics that don't want to admit that drunk driving is something that comes from alcoholism. So American Muslims in many ways need that kickstart to try to wake them up, because on the one hand, we're the only ones that can fix this problem. And on the other hand, at some point, America is going to get fed up. And when they get fed up, they're going to throw us good guys along with the bad ones. And we can't solve a problem if it becomes a war against all of Islam.
And that brings me to the, white Catholic growing up kid that I am. There's a certain feeling of helplessness, I think, for a lot of Americans, because we don't know what to do. We don't know what to do. We're constantly being fed sources that, or sources of information that reinforce the notion. And I want to get to this right now. Is it okay for Muslims to lie to people who do not believe in Islam? I mean, that has come up, and people have quoted the hadith to me that it comes from, and yet it's been disputed. It's just, there's a level of distrust there because we don't understand.
Well, that's not the Islam I learned. My kids, when I sit down to dinner with them every night, we say the same thing at our dinner table that we say and I say on national television. So, pandering and lying to people, telling people what they want to hear is not something Muslims have a monopoly on. Certainly the theology that tells Muslims, and I'm glad you said hadith, because I will tell you that the vast majority of these types of corrupt practices, Hamas's charter that says kill a Jew behind every stone, that is a quote supposedly from the hadith. Many of us believe that the tradition of the Prophet Muhammad was corrupted by the writings of so many tribal entities that said things and wrote things in the name of the Prophet that didn't even begin to be written until 100 years later. So the majority of reform that has to happen, that's why we formed, our organization now, our coalition called the Muslim Reform Movement. I'd ask people to go to that website, muslimreformmovement.org, and you'll see at the top of it a quote that we believe in. It says, ideas do not have rights, human beings do. And that's one of the biggest reasons the Islamic world has been stuck in the 12th century, is that these governments prevent any type of questioning of what is thought to be scripture. Our close ally, Raif Badawi, is in jail being flogged every Friday in front of a mosque in Jeddah by the Saudi government because he supposedly left Islam when, in fact, he's a Sunni Muslim. And he questioned the clerics' definitions of what is the Quran and what is not and what is Islam. And this is really the only way you can resurrect, if there is what I believe to be a Abrahamic faith within Islam. We have to be able to have these public debates, and there's not been a setting and platforms for that to happen.
In the United States, I would imagine it's challenging but not impossible for you to advocate for this. Are there other organizations around the world in predominantly Muslim countries, the kind of theocracies that you are firmly against? Are they all imprisoned at this moment, as the gentleman you were just talking about? Is there an opportunity there? Because it seems like in the United States, less of a problem than it is when you're talking about attacking it at the roots, as you explained in the first part of the hour. Are there organizations, or is it too dangerous?
Well, that's the issue. It's like the place where we have the best laboratory to do it, there's less motivation and urgency to do it.
Right.
The place, if you go to Egypt, where they were fighting against the Brotherhood, the reformers like Imam Ibn Zayd or Imam Sharqawi or others who infected me, they're in jail, or they died in jail. So, El-Sisi's of the world might give a great speech in front of Al-Azhar University last January saying how Islam needs reform and you guys have to take, he was speaking in the belly of the beast at the Al-Azhar University, which is basically the Vatican of Islam. And he said the right things about violence, but what he did not say, he did not mention the words freedom. He did not mention the word democracy. He did not talk about separation of mosque and state. He just wants a political Islam that doesn't have the violent underbelly that is run like a corporation or like a general runs the military, which is what he is. So they continue to be part of the problem because the oxygen is the same, be it a corporate political Islam of the royal families of these monarchs, or be it a grassroots viral political Islam of Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and Muslim Brotherhood. So we have to somehow get American Muslims, and we have many organizations that form this Muslim reform movement. The Quilliam Foundation, based in London, signed on and put out a press release yesterday as joining us. In Denmark, a parliamentarian by the name of Nasser Khader joined us in our summit, and he's in the Danish Parliament. In Canada, Muslims for a Better Tomorrow, or Muslims Facing Tomorrow, joined us, and that includes Raheel Raza, who just did a documentary on the Honor Diaries, and another documentary just came out called By the Numbers that looks at what's happening to minorities across the Muslim world. So there are many voices of reform. Azra Nomani, who you may have seen on Meet the Press a few weeks ago, has been really one of the leading voices in this reform movement. So there are many of us out there. The problem is getting the attention and the bandwidth that, we're up against sort of these billion-dollar corporations of governments that are feeding Islamic groups in America as the apologists for our community that really just want to put America on the defense. And I think it's time for America to go on the offense.
I couldn't agree more. When we get back, I got to take a quick check on traffic here in just a second. But I want to ask, is the reform going to come from the United States or the Western world? Or does the reform truly have to bubble up from the heart of Islam, from Saudi Arabia, from the Middle East? We're talking with Dr. Zuhdi Jasser. We'll wrap up our conversation after this. But let's just do, is John there? Let's do a quick check of traffic with John Morrissey. Hello, John.
Hello, Mandy. That drive into Highlands Ranch on eastbound C47 670 is a tough one. From Kipling, you're backed up all the way over to Santa Fe because of an accident. Actually, you know what? That looks like more like a stall, but in either case, you've got the left lane blocked of eastbound C470 right there at Santa Fe, and you're backed up all the way back to Kipling. Drive through downtown is pretty sluggish this afternoon. Not as bad as you might expect. It's been worse this time of day this week. That ramp from eastbound 670 to southbound I-25 is pretty sluggish. Drive between I-25 and 270, loaded up on I-70 in both directions. 270 is pretty heavy as well. Big delays in the Springs, bad crash southbound I-25, your guard to the gods, several miles of backups there. And a very wintry drive up in the high country with snow up in the high country. Those high mountain peaks are very slick. Vail Pass is open over with I-70. CBS 4 weather, light snow overnight down to 19. We'll get 3 to 6 inches by the time all this ends tomorrow afternoon, and a high of 25. It's 35 right now. Belco Credit Union sponsored this traffic report. 4 o'clock, our next update on the traffic leader, KOA News Radio.
Start the year off right with the best produce around. Right now at your local Whole Foods Market, get organic navel oranges for just 98 cents a pound. Whole Foods Market, America's healthiest grocery store.
345 on KOA News Radio, now heard on 850 AM and 94.1 FM. Talking to you, Dr. Zuhdi Jasser. Dr. Jasser, what can I do? I'm a white chick from the suburbs. What do I do? Can I do anything?
Absolutely. We now have a tool that is really easy. Our Muslim Reform Movement has a 2-page declaration with some of the things I mentioned in the last part of the hour. We took it to a mosque in Massachusetts Avenue in Washington, taped it on their door. They came out, ripped it down, and we had a conversation with them. I've had folks from Colorado, from Ohio, from Florida call us and say, we don't know any Muslims, but we're going to take that declaration to our local Muslim community and ask them what they think. Now, there's a lot of reforms that have to happen for Muslims to get to the point on that declaration, but it's the goalpost. It's basically the principles that are the contract of society in America. And if Muslims believe those things, then they can begin to create institutions that will force our clerics to reform the ideas of our faith to get there. So use that declaration as the beginning of conversations at universities, with your members of Congress on how to vet refugees, with your business leaders when they do interfaith work with churches and synagogues and mosques. Use that declaration as a starting point to have a conversation about, well, do you believe in these principles? And if they tell you, well, we do in America, but in a Muslim majority society, we would use the Quran as the Constitution, that should raise red flags that these people are basically an insurgency, versus those who say, well, we believe in these principles and we're going to roll up our sleeves and start to, get imams on board who will help us get these principles into the interpretation of Islamic law.
As I mentioned before the traffic break there, can the Reformation come from the West, or does it need to come from the heart of Islam?
Both. It's not going to, I think it's going to come from Muslims in the West that will be protected and given platforms by the most potent, strongest country on the planet. Because if America decides to get checked out from this conflict, which is really what President Obama's policy has been, look at what's happening in the world. The world will not last long. 70% of the world lives under some type of dictatorship. You take China and Russia out of that, you're left with Muslim-majority countries. So, the bottom line is that America cannot lead it. You're right. The president cannot become a theologian-in-chief, but America's founding principles were about pushing back against theocracy, and we can take sides within this battle in the, within the House of Islam, and I think we should, because short of that, there's only 2 other options. One is to just try to build a wall around America and protect ourselves, and I can tell you, if the Saudis and Iranians get into a hot war tomorrow, our gas prices will be increased 10 times. So we're not energy independent, which we should be, but if we don't and we decide we can't put a wall around America, if we change who we are, which is an immigrant ideology that actually is one of the main protections against radicalization of Muslims, is that you can immigrate and become American. I'm not saying we should open our doors to everyone, but shutting our walls completely changes who we are and actually allows the ISIS narrative to win.
I struggle with that. I really do struggle with that, simply because the vetting process, even according to the FBI, they're like, we can't vet. We don't know. And I am with a lot of Americans, Dr. Jasser, and I wish I could just be as enthusiastic and open and say we've always welcomed the people who are struggling and suffering. And I don't want anyone to suffer in Syria, but you see the pictures of what's happening in Europe right now, where Europe in some areas are being overrun by people from North Africa and honestly third world countries to a certain extent. And they're not adopting the value system of Europe. They're undermining the value system of Europe, and it's creating a bit of havoc. And it's hard to say, hey, give us your tired, your poor, and you're hungry when you see what's happening to a similar society in Europe.
I don't disagree with you. I think that you and I are on the same page there. The only issue is packaging and messaging, which is put a pause button on all immigration. Say that you're not going, and I have family a couple miles away from chemical weapons attacks that are just begging to try to leave. So, yes, I do have a dog in the fight, but I realize that there are many also. I mean, if they've had people come from northern Syria down into Damascus, and they're like, wait a minute, you guys are probably ISIS,
Right.
They don't want them there either, so I get it. But the bottom line is that we fought many wars. I served on the USS El Paso. One of my closest friends was a Vietnamese immigrant whose family escaped Vietnam and had communists in their family, but he rejected that and rejected the Soviets and was one of the greatest American patriots I ever knew. So every war we fought, be it Vietnam, be it World War II, we were fighting enemies in which we took in immigrants, but realized that within those immigrant populations were ideologies that we were fighting. And our immigrant paperwork asked, are you a member of the Communist Party? We were vetting for these things. So right now you're right. We're not vetting for it, so we should put a pause button. But we shouldn't say, no, we're not going to let them in, because from a narrative perspective, the Iran media, the Russian media, others will use that to say that America is no different than us.
Well, I cannot disagree with. I want to bring a caller on because I have a feeling that Patrick is probably indicative of some of the other callers that I've had in the past, 10 years that just honestly have questions about things they've heard or questions about what is going on with Islam. Patrick, you're on with Dr. Zuhdi Jasser.
Thanks. Thank you, Doctor. I've spent the last 15 years living in Islamic countries, 10 years in Indonesia and 4.5 years in Mauritania, Western Africa. And there's two things that I see, no matter how moderate you are, that create conflict with the West. And one is in the work pattern. There's the 5 times to prayer and Ramadan in shift patterns. So I'm interested to get your opinion about how that is. But the main question I wanted to ask is, there's a requirement in Islam that if you marry a non-Islamist, they have to convert to Islam. And I feel that that's a method of covert conversion within the societies. And I have a real problem with it. I just want to get what your feeling is about that requirement and if there's any compromise.
Those are two great questions. The first one, I'll tell you, I was just on Fox a couple hours ago talking about the Cargill situation in Colorado, where you had the Council on American Islamic Relations basically ushering 200 Muslims into the unemployment line. And, these Muslims said Cargill's been working with them, a meat processing plant, for years, giving them time to pray and allowing them to have flexible breaks. But all of a sudden, 11 of them came and said they wanted to pray at the same time. They said, you can't do that. It doesn't make sense. I worked through the Navy, worked through many different places, took my breaks to pray. I never asked for special accommodations. People need breaks for medical and other things. So, the issue is that these groups, the Council on American Islamic Relations, in the name of political Islam, separatism, and trying to push this meme that America is anti-Muslim, will exploit vulnerable groups like Somalis in order to tell them that they aren't getting their rights that they deserve, and they pushed them into walking out. They left the job. They were fired because they didn't show up to work for 3 days. And I think you're right. This was, Cargill did everything they could, and I think it's a perfect example of the question you're asking, which is, listen, if you're in America, there is a contract in society in which religious freedom is about not having one faith take any precedence over the other. And the last thing about the intermarriage, I couldn't agree more.
I wanted to make a comment about that.
We're almost out of time, Patrick, so I'm going to let Dr. Jasser answer and then go from there.
Yeah, the intermarriage question is important. I disagree with that. I don't think that type of ruling exists. I think those are radical Islamists that believe that. The Quran clearly says that you can marry a Jew or a Christian wife to raise your children, and she would not need to convert. Now, the opposite, I think, is what you're talking about. Since we believe the kids take the religion of the father, that there is a significant theological belief that a Muslim woman could not marry a non-Muslim man. I disagree with that, but that needs some deep reform, because if our declaration believes in the equality of men and women. If you believe in that, then you can't say that it's one standard for a man marrying a non-Muslim woman versus a woman marrying it. But that clearly needs reform, and we see that in other faiths also in the issue of the faith of the kids.
Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, I so appreciate your time. I hope we can have you on again. You can find out information about how you can go hear him as part of the Foreign Policy Summit at the Steamboat Institute at my blog at KOANewsRadio.com on the Mandy Connell page. Dr. Jasser, thank you so much for making time today.
Appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
No problem. Have a great day. We are going to now wrap things up.